So one of the ways that we can notice that entities are involved in a situation with human beings is to do with when people get into a very tense and stressed state and they start lashing out and start behaving in a way which is way outside of what you'd expect from human behaviour. There's one particular example that came very strongly to my mind. It was a newspaper article a couple of years ago about a couple on holiday. They had a young child and they were in one of these holiday complexes, apartments, and they were several floors up, and the man in question took hold of his child, and his wife was looking at him as he was doing this. They were having a big row between the two of them. At one point she noticed that something appeared to pass over this man's face, and it was as if he became a different person altogether. And then the story is, in the newspaper article, he dropped his child and his child fell several floors down to the child's death. And the police were involved, as of course you'd expect. But my real revelation from reading that newspaper article, it was so clear that the woman described the man literally becoming possessed, as if some other agency than his normal consciousness for that moment in time was actually in charge. So one of the things that these entities tend to do is they tend to cause people to do things they wouldn't dream of doing otherwise. And another aspect of the way that they behave is by literally suggesting. So a classic example of entity possession is when people talk about hearing voices, and the voices suggest they do all sorts of diabolical things, whether it's harming another or harming themselves. In extreme cases, the voices suggest that they kill people, or to create a big argument, drama, that kind of situation. So what I notice in all these extreme situations I'm talking about, the entities are effectively feeding upon the negative behaviour of the human beings. So it's just as much as human beings can feed themselves from the food they eat, for these entities, their food is literally human negativity when people are meting out harshness or hostility to each other. That seems to be another aspect of being able to understand exactly what's going on. When we talk about entity possession, we see the behaviour that would not ever be normally experienced, like the man dropping his child to the child's death, and then just these extreme conflict situations. And it's very, very clear when you study these that the entities are actually feeding off this kind of behaviour. And it's such a strange thing, because from my perspective as a shaman, what I'm aware of is that all of these are effectively cries for help by the entity to say, this is not our home, we cannot stand being here, and we are behaving in more and more of an extreme way to attract your attention, that you're going to get something done about it, find an appropriate healer or shaman, and then once the entities are released, they're released to their own heaven, and the problem is solved. So that's just another little aspect about how you can detect entities in human behaviour. It's these real extremes of behaviour that are the clues. Okay, so you're talking about the situation where a person may be spending a lot of time in a negative state of mind. And if we can just visualise that, visualise someone spending a lot of time being very negative about themselves and everybody else, a lot of blame going on, a lot of judging and gossiping. In a situation like that, you can imagine that if there are entities out there, and as long as they're on this third dimensional plane, the only way they can derive nourishment is to feed on human negativity. It just seems very clear and obvious that yes, they would be attracted to that sort of person. So a person with a negative predisposition that was expressing themselves in that way would over time find themselves becoming more and more negative, as they find themselves with more and more of these negative energies literally feeding upon their behaviour. I can see that fits the pattern. Yeah, right, okay, the power of the word in cursing. Yes. So again, if the person is clearly possessed, then their hearing voices, this seems to be one of the universal symptoms that we notice in people with strong entity possession. The voices are suggesting them to do this, suggesting them to do that. In a situation like that, once a person becomes weak enough that they are literally doing what the entities want, then that's when they are most likely to start to engage in these extreme kinds of behaviour. And it starts off as just simply thinking and talking negatively about a person. It descends further into gossip and judgment, and then when it goes all the way down that particular rabbit hole, it does end up with a person literally cursing other people. And so much cursing, see is done in such a state of ignorance. People have no idea what they're doing, and it's because of this prevailing general ignorance in the human population about the power of the word. It's such a funny thing to get your head around, is to realise that actually us human beings are extraordinarily powerful in terms of our ability to create. Literally 6 people can get together, sit down and discuss something, and then the result of that could be they actually sell up their individual homes and buy a piece of land and create their own community. That's an example of how the positive thought of a group of people can literally create a new world for all those people. Suddenly they're all living together in the community of their dreams. Hey, isn't that amazing? Well, in a similar but opposite way, that negative energy taken to that ultimate extreme can cause people to start to form groups where they get together to gossip about people. That's on the mildest level, but you take it all the way through to the most extreme level, and they start to form groups to actually deliberately practice black magic, which is a very conscious form of cursing, where people are literally going out of their way to deliberately harm other people, using the power of their word to set things in motion through the form of the curse. So yes, it's a very serious matter.
Yeah, and you wonder what kind of payoff they get. Maybe it's an illusory power grab.
I think that's an interesting point to look at. Yes, what is it that the person gains from cursing another person? Well, the first thing I would say about that is, as soon as a person has got the mind set, and I use the word set quite deliberately, to start to curse another person, it shows something about where they're at. If they've got to that point, they've certainly slipped into what we would call ego state, because they're judging that other person to be somehow worse than they are. They're looking at that person, they're thinking, oh look, I'm better than that, I'm not as bad as that person, and then they're using that power of the word to say that person is such and such, that person does such and such. And when these curses are repeated over many times, they start to take on a force and a life of their own. And I've spoken about this before in films where people can actually experience so much cursing from someone close to them, they take on the qualities. The child could literally become so cursed, they become cursed into stupidity. The partner, husband or wife, could be so cursed by their partner that they become cursed into being the very violent person that the other person is constantly telling them that they are. Oh, you're this, you're that, you're the other. And the more they say this person, the more this person inevitably will start to take on these qualities, unless they can become conscious enough to realise what's being done. If they can wake up to the fact that they're being cursed, then they can use the mechanism of getting the blackboard and rubbing them all out as the person puts them on, or using my gesture of, that's nothing to do with me. But so long as the person is asleep, then they're very amenable to being cursed. As soon as a person starts to wake up and realise that's what's going on, then we literally regain the power for ourselves. So a person who's got a habitual pattern to curse other people is doing it really to make themselves feel better. Because if they can see someone as being worse than them, that means they're better than the person they're cursing, so it makes them feel better. So it's a very cheap ploy to gain energy, fundamentally. They're wanting to literally raise their energy up in the only way they know how, which is to put somebody else down.
Wow. So a branch of that, maybe the fourth way that people get into the dark side, is it true that maybe if you get into drugs and heroin, where does that start? Maybe is it the dark side that makes you crave drugs, or is it the drugs that make your aura so weak and susceptible to these things, or does it not even have an effect?
Well, I want to say something that is probably going to sound quite controversial, which is that in a sense there is a great honesty about a person who uses heroin. And this is a strange thing to say, but I do really mean this, because one of the things you'll notice about people who do use these really heavy drugs like heroin is that they've got a very great sensitivity. They find the world to be too harsh a place, and their desire is to wrap themselves up in a comforting blanket which insulates them from the harsh realities of what's going on in the outside world. So I can see that there's an aspect in the process of someone becoming habituated to heroin which is an honest thing, and it's an honest thing of finding the world too harsh a place for them. And so they retreat away from the world into that. Unfortunately, what tends to happen quite early on in this process is something incredibly undesirable. It was my teacher that explained this to all of us when we were training, and he said, what you need to understand about a person who is a real habitual user of a very heavy pharmaceutical drug like crack cocaine or heroin, what they have effectively is they have a black vortex which is attached to them. Now in my work you'll realise that the blue vortex is one of the primary tools I use for entity release. But this is not a blue vortex I'm talking about a black vortex. And what a black vortex tends to do is it tends to suck in all energy within its area. So one of the really unpleasant aspects about the long-term user of these heavy drugs is they become takers, they become users, and they will literally manipulate other people into giving them anything and everything that they want to keep their habit alive. And I remember a very honest conversation with a good friend of mine that used to take heroin many years ago, and she just said totally honestly that when she was very much younger and she was a user of heroin, she actually got together in a relationship with someone and she literally drained his entire financial resources. When they got together he was a rich man, and by the end of it he was penniless because she literally exhausted all his financial and material resources. So this is where I go back to this idea of the black vortex. So if you're in a situation where you want to help people who are taking these drugs, you've got a really difficult road ahead of you, and what you have to accept is that the very first thing they're going to want to do is they're going to want to take your energy. And it's way beyond conscious control at this point. You can't really turn to that heroin user and say, look, you're a bad person. It isn't like that. They are completely in the thrall of something which is way beyond their control by the time they become a regular user. And the black vortex is simply demanding all energy from the immediate environment. And if you're in their immediate environment, that's going to include you and anybody else they come into contact with. And so thus, my teacher gave us this very strong advice. He says when it comes to working with such people, shamanically, if you're in any doubt whatsoever, you walk away. You only work with such people if you're absolutely convinced that you've got the power and the strength to deal with such people. And my own personal experience of having worked with some people with these conditions is that what tends to happen is they tend to take a huge amount of my energy, and they tend to get an enormous benefit in the short term, and then they go right back to their ways of behaving because that black vortex is still there. So it does take great skill to be able to deal with such people, and my personal feeling is until the person has made the conscious and deliberate choice for change, you're in a hiding to nothing. And it's rather like the old story of, if you know an alcoholic, do you go and buy him a bottle of whiskey? Is that really the wisest thing you can do? Or are you simply just taking him further and further down his rabbit hole, which he's going down anyway, in which case why get involved? It's only when he's reached bottom that he can then look up at you and say, help, I'm in the gutter, I really need some help. At that point it becomes possible, because he's bottomed out, it's then possible to start to move back up again into the path of the light side. But when a person is really, with conscious and deliberate intent, hell-bent on going down, the best thing we can do is to just give them some time, send them the love, and wait with patience. And I know it's a difficult thing to do.